The story begins in Florida, on a stretch of highway where tragedy unfolded in the most preventable of ways. A truck driver attempted an illegal maneuver, a U-turn across lanes of high-speed traffic. A minivan collided with the trailer, and 3 lives were lost in an instant. The suspect, identified as a 28-year-old Indian national named Harjinder Singh, was not simply an ordinary driver caught in error. He had entered the United States illegally through the Mexican border in 2018. He claimed asylum on the grounds that he feared returning to his home country. He was released while his case moved through the courts. Years later, he was able to secure commercial driving credentials through various state processes, despite profound failures in language proficiency testing and regulatory oversight. The Department of Transportation has now admitted that Washington State issued him a full commercial license in violation of federal guidelines. New Mexico police failed to verify his English skills during an inspection. California granted him a limited license in 2024. These are not minor clerical oversights. They are the cumulative results of systemic failures across multiple states and agencies. At the center of it all is a simple reality: the absence of coordination between federal immigration enforcement, state-level licensing systems, and corporate responsibility in the trucking industry. And the result of this absence is measured in lives lost on an American highway. When examined through a broader lens, this case does not stand alone. It intersects with several critical debates that define the American political landscape in 2025. The first is immigration, specifically the unresolved tension between humanitarian asylum claims and the enforcement of border security. For years, individuals who cross into the United States without authorization have been allowed to remain while their asylum cases proceed. The legal backlog has grown into the hundreds of thousands. Many of these individuals seek employment, and some secure work in sectors facing labor shortages. Trucking is one of those sectors. Companies desperate for drivers turn to whoever is available, and state systems issue licenses without comprehensive federal verification. The result is predictable. Individuals who should never have been authorized to drive 18-wheelers across American highways are placed behind the wheel of vehicles that weigh tens of thousands of pounds. The consequences of this gap between federal intent and state action are not abstract. They are deadly. This particular case is one example, but it reflects a wider structural breakdown. The second debate illuminated here is the balance of power between red states and blue states. Florida, a conservative state, is now seeking to prosecute Singh for vehicular homicide. California, a liberal state, was the place where he was most recently licensed. Washington State and New Mexico also played roles in the failure of oversight. Each of these states operates under different political philosophies and different attitudes toward immigration enforcement. The Department of Transportation notes that Washington violated federal guidelines, yet the state proceeded. This illustrates a pattern. Some states view immigration enforcement as a federal responsibility and choose not to align their own practices with stricter standards. Others push aggressively for tougher controls. The conflict creates an uneven patchwork, where the same individual can move across jurisdictions, receiving different treatment and different opportunities. When the stakes involve heavy vehicles on public roads, inconsistency becomes more than a political talking point. It becomes a matter of public safety, and the deaths on Florida's turnpike demonstrate the consequences. The third debate is corporate responsibility. Singh was driving for White Hawk Carriers Incorporated, a California-based company. Records show the company had no prior crash record, but its insurance had been revoked, and it was not currently authorized to operate. Still, Singh was driving for them. This reflects a larger problem in the logistics sector. Small carriers, sometimes little more than paper companies, emerge to meet demand, often cutting corners on compliance. The enforcement systems are reactive, not proactive. A company can continue operating until it is caught in violation, and by that time damage may already have been done. This regulatory lag interacts with the immigration and licensing failures, creating an environment where risk accumulates silently until it manifests in tragedy. The pattern is not limited to trucking. It is a microcosm of how globalized labor, fragmented governance, and corporate expediency interact to create vulnerabilities within the United States itself. This brings us to the historical context. The American trucking industry has long relied on immigrant labor. From Central America to South Asia, workers have filled shortages in a sector characterized by long hours, low margins, and high turnover. The industry is essential to the functioning of the national economy. Nearly three-quarters of freight in the United States moves by truck. But as demand grows and wages stagnate, recruitment becomes harder. Companies reach further into vulnerable labor pools, and oversight often relaxes under pressure. In earlier decades, immigration, enforcement, and licensing were more tightly aligned. But as asylum backlogs increased in the last 2 decades, the number of individuals with uncertain status living and working in the United States surged. This transformed transportation, agriculture, and construction. The Florida crash is not merely a single point of failure. It is a symptom of how structural pressures have reshaped American labor markets. When states begin issuing commercial licenses to asylum seekers without federal clearance, it demonstrates a drift away from coordinated national regulation. That drift is part of a wider trend in American governance: fragmentation and polarization. The political implications are profound. Conservatives immediately seized upon the story as evidence that federal immigration enforcement has failed. They point to the deaths of 3 Florida residents as the cost of lax border policies. They argue that asylum loopholes allow individuals to remain in the country for years without resolution. Liberals respond by emphasizing humanitarian obligations, pointing to asylum law as a fundamental component of American values. But the debate rarely addresses the practical intersection with industries like trucking. Politicians talk about border walls, deportations, and asylum courts. But the machinery of state licensing, corporate compliance, and federal oversight remains largely invisible in public discourse. Yet that machinery is where the system failed in this case. And so the Florida crash becomes ammunition in a wider partisan battle, each side using the story to reinforce its existing narrative, while the deeper structural issues remain unresolved. This cycle of politicization without systemic reform is itself a defining feature of American governance in the current era. Beyond politics, the case raises questions of national security and resilience. Transportation is a critical infrastructure. Trucks deliver food, medicine, fuel, and consumer goods. They connect ports, rail yards, and distribution centers. Any systemic weakness in the trucking sector becomes a vulnerability for the nation as a whole. If individuals who lack English proficiency, lack legal work authorization, and lack proper vetting are allowed to operate heavy vehicles, then accidents are only one of the risks. There are also concerns of intentional misuse. The memory of attacks using vehicles in crowded areas in Europe and North America remains fresh. A system that allows poorly vetted drivers access to 18-wheelers creates openings that could be exploited. This is not to imply intent in the Florida case, but in strategic terms, any vulnerability can be exploited, and adversaries watch closely for such openings. The overlap between immigration loopholes, regulatory laxity, and corporate opportunism becomes more than a domestic governance issue. It becomes a matter of national resilience in the face of both accident and threat. At this point, we must zoom out even further to the global context. Migration pressures are intensifying worldwide. Conflicts, economic instability, and climate change push people to move across borders in unprecedented numbers. The United States is a magnet, both for opportunity and for asylum. India, the country from which Singh originates, has seen increasing numbers of citizens attempting to enter the United States through Latin America. This reflects not only domestic conditions in India, but also the global networks of smuggling and labor recruitment that facilitate such journeys. These networks are transnational businesses in their own right, connecting demand in the United States with supply from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They operate in the shadows, exploiting legal gaps and bureaucratic backlogs. Once individuals arrive, they often enter industries with labor shortages. Trucking is a prime example. What appears as a single case of regulatory failure in Florida is actually connected to global flows of people, capital, and labor. The cold logic of geopolitics demands that we recognize these connections. Consider also the role of state and federal dynamics in shaping the global perception of the United States. When Washington state issues licenses in violation of federal guidelines, or when California grants limited licenses to individuals without secure status, it signals fragmentation. Adversaries abroad interpret this as weakness, as a lack of cohesion in American governance. Allies interpret it as inconsistency. Domestic companies interpret it as an opportunity to exploit gaps. And migrants themselves interpret it as a signal that persistence may eventually lead to access. This feedback loop perpetuates the very pressures that strain the system. From the perspective of strategic analysis, the Florida case is not just about one driver or one crash. It is about the projection of American competence and credibility. If the United States cannot align its internal systems on something as basic as highway safety, then questions arise about its ability to project coherence in larger arenas, from defense to diplomacy. The tragedy in Florida, therefore, operates on multiple levels. At the human level, 3 lives are lost. Families are grieving. At the legal level, an individual faces charges of vehicular homicide. At the state level, jurisdictions are in conflict over licensing and compliance. At the federal level, immigration enforcement and regulatory oversight are exposed as inadequate. At the corporate level, a trucking company is under investigation. And at the geopolitical level, the case illustrates how domestic fragmentation in the United States interacts with global migration pressures to create vulnerabilities. This multi-layered reality is the essence of modern geopolitics. No event exists in isolation. Each connects outward, revealing patterns and exposing weaknesses. What then are the possibilities for the future? Several trajectories can be envisioned. One is that this case becomes a catalyst for reform. Federal authorities may tighten oversight of state licensing, ensuring that asylum seekers cannot be issued commercial driving credentials without resolution of their cases. Congress may use the power of the purse to discipline states that defy federal guidelines. Companies may face harsher penalties for employing drivers without proper authorization. Such measures would reduce the risk of recurrence. But another possibility is inertia. The partisan divide may prevent meaningful reform. Each side may use the case to reinforce its narrative without addressing the systemic failures. In that scenario, the pattern continues and further tragedies occur. A third possibility is escalation, where the issue becomes a flashpoint in the broader national debate on immigration, fueling more extreme policy proposals and more aggressive state-level defiance. Which trajectory unfolds will shape not only domestic safety, but also the global image of the United States as a coherent or fragmented power. To conclude, the crash on Florida's Turnpike is not an isolated accident. It is a prism through which we can see the interplay of immigration, regulation, state-federal conflict, corporate responsibility, and global migration pressures. The cold logic perspective insists that we look beyond the immediate and connect the dots to the systemic. Every tragedy is both specific and structural. Every failure is both human and institutional. In this case, 3 lives were lost, but the implications extend far beyond those individuals. They extend to the credibility of American governance, the resilience of critical infrastructure, and the dynamics of global migration. To see the whole picture requires stepping back, examining the intersections, and recognizing that in geopolitics, the smallest events often reveal the deepest truths.